A man who'd sworn off the world found a dying child in a blizzard, and what he discovered buried beneath his mountain land would force him to choose between the safety of silence and a secret worth $270 million. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The wind screamed through the pines like something wounded and wild. It tore across the ridge, bending trees that had stood for 100 years, shaking the very bones of the mountain. Inside a timber cabin perched on the edge of nowhere, a man sat alone by a wood stove, the firelight casting shadows across his weathered face. His name was Russell Kane, though it had been years since anyone had spoken it aloud. He was 46 years old, but the mountains had aged him in ways the calendar never could. Deep lines carved paths around his eyes, not from laughter, but from squinting into too many sunrises alone. His hands were scarred and calloused, the kind of hands that had stopped asking for gentleness and learned to survive on strength. His beard was thick and streaked with grey, and his hair hung past his shoulders, tied back with a strip of leather. He looked like a man the world had forgotten, and that was exactly how he wanted it. 15 years. That's how long Russell had been up here, hidden in the Colorado Rockies, miles from the nearest town, farther still from the life he'd left behind. 15 years of silence, solitude, and something close to peace, though he'd never call it that. Peace was for people who'd earned it. Russell was just hiding. The cabin was small but solid, built with his own hands from timber he'd felled himself. One room served as kitchen, bedroom, and living space. A loft above held supplies: dried meat, canned goods, ammunition, kerosene. Everything he needed to survive the brutal winters that turned these mountains into a frozen hell for 5 months out of the year. He'd chosen this place deliberately. No roads led here, only a narrow trail he'd cut himself, winding through dense forest and over rocky terrain that kept out anyone without serious intent. The nearest neighbor was 12 miles south, an old cattle rancher who respected boundaries and asked no questions. Once a month, Russell made the long trek down to the supply store in a town so small it didn't even have a stoplight. He bought flour, salt, coffee, and kerosene. He paid cash. He didn't make conversation. Then he disappeared back into the wilderness like smoke. Most people in town had theories about him. Some said he was a veteran with PTSD. Others whispered he'd killed someone and was hiding from the law. A few thought he was just crazy. They were all wrong, but Russell never corrected them. Let them think what they wanted. The truth was simpler and somehow worse. 15 years ago, Russell Kane had been a different man. He'd worn tailored suits and Italian leather shoes. He'd owned a construction company in Denver that built luxury homes for people with more money than sense. He had a business partner named Marcus, a man he'd known since college, someone he trusted like a brother. And he had a wife, Claire, with honey-colored hair and a smile that used to make him believe the world was good. They'd been married 8 years. No kids yet, but they'd been talking about it. Russell had been happy, or at least he'd thought he was. Then, one October afternoon, he came home early from a job site to surprise Claire for her birthday. He'd bought flowers, made reservations at her favorite restaurant, even splurged on a necklace he couldn't quite afford. He opened the front door of their suburban home with a grin on his face and froze. Claire was on the couch. Marcus was with her. The flowers hit the floor. Russell didn't remember much of what happened next. Just shouting, crying, excuses that didn't matter. Claire said it had been going on for 2 years. 2 years of lies, of coming home to a woman who kissed him goodnight while planning a future with someone else. But that wasn't even the worst part. Within a week, Russell discovered Marcus had been embezzling from the company. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, siphoned off through fake invoices and phantom contractors. By the time Russell untangled the mess, the business was bankrupt. Lawsuits piled up, clients sued for unfinished projects, subcontractors demanded payment Russell couldn't make. He lost everything: the company, the house, his savings, his reputation. Claire filed for divorce and married Marcus 6 months later. They moved to California. Last Russell heard, they had 2 kids and a house in Malibu. He could have fought back, could have pressed charges, hired lawyers, made Marcus pay. But something in Russell had broken so completely that fighting felt pointless. What was the point of justice when the people you loved most had already destroyed you? So he walked away, sold what little he had left, bought supplies and tools, and drove north until the roads ended. Then he kept going. He found this land, 60 acres of wilderness no one wanted, and he built a life with his hands. A simple life, a silent life, a life where no one could hurt him because no one could reach him. For 15 years, it worked. The mountains didn't lie. They didn't betray. They just existed, cold and indifferent, and Russell had learned to prefer indifference to affection. But tonight, something was different. The storm had been building all day, clouds rolling in like bruises across the sky. By nightfall, the snow was falling so thick Russell could barely see 10 feet past his window. The wind rattled the shutters and howled down the chimney. He'd weathered storms like this before. He had enough wood stacked to last a month, enough food for longer. He'd ride it out like he always did, alone with his thoughts and the crackling fire. Then he heard it. At first he thought it was the wind, a high, keening sound that rose and fell with the gusts. But then it came again, clearer this time, cutting through the storm like a knife. Crying. Someone was crying. Russell stood slowly, every muscle in his body tense. He moved to the window and peered out into the swirling white chaos. Nothing. Just snow and darkness and the skeletal shapes of trees bending in the wind. He waited. Then he heard it again. Closer now. A child's voice, thin and desperate, calling out for help. Russell's heart, which hadn't beat fast in years, began to pound. He grabbed his coat, pulled on his boots, and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him like a fist. Snow stung his face, and the wind tried to shove him back inside. He squinted into the darkness, his breath misting in front of him. "Hello?" he shouted. His voice was swallowed by the storm. Then he saw movement. A small shape, barely visible, stumbling through the snow about 30 yards from the cabin. Russell ran. His boots sank deep with every step, but he forced himself forward, arms pumping, lungs burning. When he reached the shape, he dropped to his knees. It was a boy, maybe 8 years old, maybe younger. He was soaked through, his clothes frozen stiff, his lips blue. His eyes were open but unfocused, staring at nothing. He wasn't crying anymore. He wasn't making any sound at all. "Hey," Russell said, his voice rough from disuse. "Hey, kid, can you hear me?" The boy's eyes flickered toward him but didn't focus. Hypothermia. Russell had seen it before. The kid was shutting down. Without thinking, Russell scooped the boy into his arms. He was shockingly light, all bones and soaked fabric. Russell turned and ran back toward the cabin, his mind racing. What the hell was a kid doing out here? Where were his parents? How long had he been out in the cold? He kicked open the cabin door and carried the boy inside, setting him down gently on the floor near the wood stove. The boy's skin was ice cold to the touch. Russell worked fast, stripping off the boy's frozen jacket, his soaked shirt and pants, his thin sneakers that had no business being anywhere near a mountain in winter. He wrapped the boy in wool blankets, then grabbed more from the loft and piled them on. He filled a pot with water and set it on the stove to heat, not too hot, just warm. Warming someone up too fast could kill them as surely as the cold. Russell knelt beside the boy and rubbed his hands, his arms, trying to get the blood flowing again. "Come on," he muttered. "Come on, kid, stay with me." The boy's eyes fluttered, his lips moved, but no sound came out. Russell kept working, kept talking, his voice low and steady even though his hands were shaking. He didn't know why his hands were shaking. He'd gutted deer without flinching, he'd set his own broken bones. But this, a child barely alive on his floor, terrified him in a way nothing had in years. After what felt like an eternity, the boy started to shiver. It was a good sign. Shivering meant the body was trying to warm itself. Russell dipped a cloth in the warm water and pressed it gently to the boy's face, wiping away the snow and grime. The boy's eyes opened wider. He looked up at Russell, and for the first time, there was recognition there. Fear, but also relief. "You're okay," Russell said, though he wasn't sure if that was true. "You're safe now." The boy's mouth opened. His voice came out as a raspy whisper. "Cold." "I know," Russell said. "I know. Just stay still. You're warming up." He heated broth on the stove, something simple he'd made from venison and root vegetables. When it was warm, he brought a mug to the boy and helped him sit up enough to sip. The boy drank slowly, his hands still trembling. After a few sips, he looked up at Russell again. "Thank you," the boy whispered. Russell nodded, unsure what to say. He hadn't spoken more than 10 words to another person in months. Now he had a child in his cabin, a child who shouldn't exist, who shouldn't be here, and he had no idea what to do. "What's your name?" Russell finally asked. The boy hesitated, like he wasn't sure if he should answer. Then, quietly, he said, "Tommy." "Tommy," Russell repeated. "Okay, I'm Russell." He paused. "Tommy, what are you doing out here? Where are your parents?" At the word parents, Tommy's face crumpled. Tears welled up in his eyes and he shook his head violently. "No," he whispered. "No, can't go back." Russell's chest tightened. "Can't go back where?" But Tommy just shook his head again, his whole body trembling now, and not from the cold. "Bad people," Tommy whispered. "They're bad people." Russell stared at the boy, his mind racing. He wanted to ask more, wanted to understand, but Tommy looked like he was about to break apart completely. So Russell did the only thing he could think of. He pulled another blanket around the boy's shoulders and said, "Okay, you don't have to go back. Not tonight. Tonight you're safe, understand?" Tommy looked at him with wide, desperate eyes and nodded. Russell sat back on his heels, running a hand through his hair. What the hell had he just done? He didn't take in strays. He didn't get involved. That was the whole point of living up here. But as he looked at Tommy, wrapped in blankets by the fire, small and fragile and terrified, he knew he couldn't turn the boy out into the storm. Not tonight. He'd figure out the rest tomorrow. That night, Russell didn't sleep. He sat in his chair by the fire, his rifle across his lap, listening to the storm rage outside. Tommy slept fitfully on the floor, curled up in a nest of blankets, occasionally crying out in his sleep. Each time he did, Russell's jaw tightened. He kept replaying Tommy's words in his head. Bad people. Can't go back. What had happened to this kid? And more importantly, was someone out there looking for him? The thought made Russell uneasy. He'd spent 15 years avoiding trouble, avoiding people, avoiding anything that might pull him back into the world he'd left behind. But trouble had found him anyway, in the form of a boy who weighed less than a sack of flour. By morning, the storm had passed. The world outside was buried in 3 feet of fresh snow, pristine and silent. Russell stood at the window, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over the peaks. Behind him, he heard Tommy stir. "Good morning," Russell said without turning around. Tommy sat up slowly, the blankets falling away. He looked around the cabin with wide eyes, taking everything in. The rough-hewn walls, the simple furniture, the shelves lined with supplies. His gaze landed on Russell, and something in his expression shifted. Not quite trust, but maybe the beginning of it. "How do you feel?" Russell asked. "Okay," Tommy said quietly. His voice was stronger than last night. "Still cold?" Russell nodded. "That'll pass. You want some food?" Tommy nodded quickly. Russell heated up more broth and some cornbread he'd made 2 days ago. He set it in front of Tommy, who ate like he hadn't seen food in days. Maybe he hadn't. Russell watched him, questions piling up in his mind. Where had Tommy come from? How long had he been wandering in the mountains? Who were these bad people he was running from? But he didn't ask. Not yet. The kid needed to eat, needed to feel safe before Russell started interrogating him. After breakfast, Russell found some old clothes in a trunk, things he'd brought from his old life and never bothered throwing away. A flannel shirt that swallowed Tommy's small frame. A pair of sweatpants he had to tie tight just to keep them from falling down. They'd have to do. "Tommy," Russell said carefully, "we need to talk." Tommy's face closed off immediately, and Russell recognized the look. It was the same expression he'd worn for years, the look of someone who'd learned that talking only led to pain. "I'm not going to make you do anything you don't want to do," Russell continued. "But I need to know if someone's looking for you, if someone's going to show up here." Tommy stared down at his hands. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a voice so small Russell almost missed it, he whispered, "My mum died." Russell's chest tightened. "When?" "Last year." Tommy's hands twisted in the oversized shirt. "She got sick. There was no money for doctors." "What about your dad?" "Gone." Tommy's voice was flat. "He left when I was little. Don't remember him." Russell swallowed hard. "So who were you with? Who's looking for you?" Tommy's breathing quickened. His eyes darted to the door like he was measuring the distance. "Tommy," Russell said gently, "I'm not going to hurt you, and I'm not going to let anyone else hurt you, but I need to understand what's going on." Tommy looked up at him, and Russell saw something in those eyes that made his stomach turn. It was the look of a child who'd seen things no child should ever see. "My uncle," Tommy finally said. "After Mum died, I went to live with my uncle and his friends. They were—" He trailed off, struggling for words. "They were mean. They did bad things. They yelled all the time. And sometimes they hurt me." Russell's hands curled into fists. "What kind of bad things?" Tommy shook his head. "I don't know all of it. They had stuff, packages, things they didn't want anyone to see. They said if I told anyone, they'd make sure I disappeared." "Jesus," Russell muttered. "We were driving," Tommy continued, his words coming faster now. "Going somewhere, I don't know where. They stopped at a gas station. I asked if I could use the bathroom, and they said yes. But I didn't go to the bathroom. I ran. I ran into the woods and I kept running." His voice broke. "I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't go back." Russell felt something crack open in his chest, something he'd kept sealed shut for 15 years. He'd spent so long protecting himself from feeling anything, from caring about anyone, that he'd forgotten what it was like. But sitting here, looking at this terrified kid who'd run until he collapsed, Russell felt it all come flooding back. The anger, the protectiveness, the fierce, desperate need to make sure nothing bad happened to someone who couldn't protect themselves. "How long were you out there?" Russell asked. Tommy shrugged. "I don't know. Days, maybe. I ate berries, drank from streams. It got colder and colder. Then the storm came and I couldn't see anything. I thought I was going to die." His eyes filled with tears. "I thought I was going to die alone." Russell moved slowly, carefully, and sat down on the floor next to Tommy. Not too close, giving the boy space, but near enough that Tommy knew he wasn't alone anymore. "You're not going to die," Russell said quietly. "And you're not alone. Not anymore." Tommy looked at him with desperate hope. "Can I stay here? Just for a little while? I won't be any trouble. I promise." Russell knew he should say no. Knew he should contact someone, the authorities, social services, someone who could handle this properly. But the thought of handing Tommy over to the system, of this kid getting lost in foster care or worse, sent back to his uncle, made Russell's blood run cold. "Yeah," Russell heard himself say. "You can stay, for a little while, until we figure things out." Tommy's whole body sagged with relief. He wiped at his eyes with the two long sleeves of Russell's shirt. "Thank you," he whispered. Russell just nodded, already wondering what the hell he'd just agreed to. The first week passed in a strange sort of rhythm. Russell had lived alone for so long that having another person in the cabin felt alien, like learning to walk in shoes that didn't quite fit. But Tommy was quiet, careful not to take up too much space. He helped where he could, washing dishes, folding blankets, stacking firewood by the door. He didn't talk much, but Russell caught him watching sometimes, studying Russell's movements like he was trying to figure out if he could trust this strange mountain man who'd pulled him from the storm. Russell, for his part, found himself hyper-aware of every sound, every movement. He kept his old radio on low, listening for news reports about a missing child. But there was nothing. No Amber Alerts, no desperate pleas from family members, no search parties combing the mountains. It was like Tommy had simply vanished from the world, and no one had noticed. Or worse, no one cared. On the 5th day, Russell took Tommy outside to teach him how to split wood. The boy was weak, malnourished, but he was eager to learn. Russell showed him how to position the log, how to swing the axe, how to let gravity do most of the work. Tommy's first few swings missed completely, the axe bouncing off at odd angles. But he didn't give up. He kept trying, his small face set with determination that reminded Russell of himself at that age. "Good," Russell said when Tommy finally split a log clean through. "That's good." Tommy beamed, and Russell felt something warm unfurl in his chest. Something he'd thought was dead. On the 7th day, while Tommy was inside sketching in an old notebook Russell had given him, Russell made the long trek down to the supply store. He needed to hear if anyone was talking, if there were whispers about a missing boy. The store was quiet, just old Jim behind the counter reading a hunting magazine. "Russell," Jim said, nodding. He was one of the few people who knew Russell's name. "Nasty storm last week." "Yeah," Russell said, loading supplies onto the counter. Flour, dried beans, rice, coffee, more than usual. Jim noticed but didn't comment. "Heard anything interesting?" Russell asked casually. Jim shrugged. "Same old. Miller's lost another cow to wolves. Highways closed till Thursday. Some folks down in Ridgemont talking about drugs coming through, but hell, when aren't they?" Russell's blood went cold. "Drugs?" "Yeah, some trafficking thing. State police are poking around, think someone's using the back roads through the mountains." Jim rang up the supplies. "Nothing that affects us up here, though." Russell paid in cash and left quickly, his mind racing. Tommy's uncle, the packages, bad things. It all clicked into place. Tommy hadn't just run from an abusive relative. He'd run from criminals, people who wouldn't stop looking if they thought he was a liability. Russell's hands tightened on the steering wheel of his old truck as he drove back up the mountain. He'd thought keeping Tommy for a few weeks, letting him recover, maybe finding him a safe place to go would be simple. But nothing about this was simple. If Tommy's uncle was involved in trafficking, if he thought Tommy could identify him or his operation, the man would search every inch of these mountains. And when he found them, he wouldn't come asking politely. Russell pulled up to the cabin and sat for a moment, staring at the smoke curling from the chimney. He could still walk away from this. Could drive Tommy to the police station in the next town over, drop him off, and disappear back into his isolation. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But when he walked inside and saw Tommy at the table, carefully sketching a pine tree he could see through the window, Russell knew he wasn't going to do that. This kid had been abandoned by everyone who should have protected him. Russell wasn't going to be another person who walked away. "Hey," Tommy said, looking up with a small smile. "I made dinner. Well, I tried. It's just soup, but I didn't burn it." Russell set down the supplies and looked at the pot on the stove, at the table set with 2 bowls, at this child who was trying so hard to be useful to earn his place. "Looks good," Russell said quietly. They ate together as the sun set outside, painting the snow orange and gold. And for the first time in 15 years, Russell didn't eat alone. What happens next will turn this mountain refuge into a battlefield, reveal a hidden fortune that men have killed to find, and remind us why sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is care about someone else. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The days turned into weeks, and something neither Russell nor Tommy expected began to happen. They started to feel like a family. Not in the way families are supposed to form, with planning and intention and legal documents, but in the quiet way of 2 people who needed each other, finding themselves in the same place at the right time. Russell taught Tommy how to read tracks in the snow, how to tell a deer print from an elk, how to identify which way an animal was moving and how long ago it passed. Tommy learned fast, his eyes bright with concentration as he crouched in the snow, studying the frozen earth like it was a book written just for him. Russell showed him how to fish through ice, how to set snares, how to purify water from the stream. Basic survival skills that every person should know, but most never learned. Tommy absorbed it all like he was starving for knowledge, for purpose, for someone to believe he was worth teaching. In the evenings after dinner, they'd sit by the fire. Russell would read aloud from the few books he owned, old westerns and survival guides mostly. Tommy would listen, his head resting against the side of Russell's chair, his eyes growing heavy. Sometimes Russell would look down and find the boy asleep, his small face peaceful in the firelight, and Russell would feel that unfamiliar warmth in his chest again. The feeling that he mattered to someone, that he was needed. It terrified him. One morning, about 3 weeks after Tommy had arrived, the boy was exploring around the cabin's perimeter. The snow had melted enough that patches of ground were visible, and Tommy had taken to collecting interesting rocks and pieces of wood for his growing collection. Russell was inside repairing a torn jacket when he heard Tommy call out, "Russell, come look at this!" Russell set down his needle and thread and stepped outside. Tommy was kneeling near the stone foundation of the cabin, brushing snow away from something. "What is it?" Russell asked. "This," Tommy said, pointing. Russell crouched beside him. There, carved into one of the foundation stones, was a symbol. It looked like a compass rose or maybe a star, with 8 points radiating from a center circle. The carving was old, weathered by years of exposure, but still clearly deliberate. Russell frowned. He'd lived here for 15 years and had never noticed this. Then again, he'd never looked. "Weird, right?" Tommy said. "I wonder what it means." Russell traced the symbol with his finger. Something about it nagged at him, a feeling he couldn't quite name. "Probably just a surveyor's mark," he said, standing up. "These mountains are full of old markers from when people were claiming land." "Maybe," Tommy said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Can I keep looking for more?" Russell hesitated. Some instinct told him to say no, to leave well enough alone, but Tommy looked so excited, so engaged with the world around him in a way Russell hadn't seen before. "Sure," Russell said. "Just don't wander too far." For the rest of the day, Russell tried to focus on his work. He had traps to check, wood to split, a dozen small tasks that kept life running smoothly in the wilderness. But his mind kept drifting back to that symbol. Why did it bother him so much? That evening, Tommy came in covered in mud and melted snow, grinning like he'd found treasure. "I found 2 more," he announced. "One on a tree about 50 yards north, and one on a rock near the stream." Russell set down the rabbit he'd been cleaning. "Show me." They went out together in the fading light. Sure enough, there they were. The same symbol, carved with the same precision, marking points around Russell's property. They weren't random. They were deliberate, placed at regular intervals like they were outlining something, marking a boundary or pointing towards something. Russell stood in the growing darkness, staring at the symbol on the tree, and felt the first whisper of unease. These mountains held secrets. He'd always known that, but he'd never imagined those secrets might be buried on his own land. "What do you think it means?" Tommy asked beside him. Russell looked down at the boy, at his curious eyes and open expression, and made a decision. He didn't know what these symbols meant, and part of him didn't want to find out. But another part, the part that had been reawakening since Tommy arrived, whispered that some things couldn't stay buried forever. "I don't know," Russell said honestly, "but maybe it's time we found out." 3 months had passed since the night Russell pulled Tommy from the storm, and the cabin had transformed from a hermit's refuge into something that almost resembled a home. Winter had deepened its grip on the mountains, burying the world in white silence that stretched from horizon to horizon. The temperature dropped so low some nights that the water in Russell's steel bucket froze solid, and the wind howled through the pines with a sound like wolves singing to the moon. But inside the cabin, there was warmth. Not just from the wood stove that crackled day and night, but from the presence of two people learning to exist together, learning to trust, learning to heal. Tommy had become Russell's shadow. Wherever Russell went, Tommy followed, watching with those wide eyes that missed nothing, absorbing every lesson like his life depended on it. And maybe it did. Russell taught him how to start a fire in the snow, how to build a shelter from pine boughs, how to navigate by the stars when the world was too dark to see your own feet. He showed Tommy which plants were edible and which would kill you, how to tell if ice was thick enough to walk on, how to stay calm when fear wanted to make you run. They fell into a routine that felt ancient and right. Wake before dawn, check the traps, split wood, melt snow for water, cook breakfast, usually oatmeal with dried berries or venison sausage Russell made himself. Then lessons, reading and writing and arithmetic that Russell taught from old textbooks he'd ordered from the general store. Tommy was smart, wickedly smart, picking up concepts faster than Russell could explain them. In the afternoons, they worked with their hands. Russell was building a new storage shed, and Tommy helped measure boards and hammer nails, his small hands learning the satisfaction of creating something solid and real. But it was the conversations that changed everything. Late at night, when the fire burned low and the darkness pressed close, Tommy would talk. Not all at once, but in pieces, fragments of a story too painful to tell straight through. He told Russell about his mother, Sarah, who'd worked 2 jobs and still couldn't afford the cancer treatments that might have saved her. About watching her waste away in a hospital bed, her hand gripping his, promising everything would be okay, even though they both knew it wouldn't. About the funeral that only 5 people attended because they'd moved so many times, running from debt collectors and bad landlords, that they'd never stayed anywhere long enough to make friends. "She tried so hard," Tommy said one night, his voice barely above a whisper. "She tried to keep me safe, to keep us together. But then she got sick and there was no money and she just gave up." Russell's throat tightened. He wanted to say something comforting, something wise, but the truth was, he knew exactly what it felt like when the people you loved gave up on you. So he just put his hand on Tommy's shoulder and squeezed, and that seemed to be enough. Tommy told him about his uncle Dean, who'd shown up at the funeral like a vulture circling a carcass. Dean was Sarah's younger brother, and she'd cut ties with him years ago for reasons she never explained to Tommy. But with no other family, no other options, the state had placed Tommy in Dean's custody. "He seemed okay at first," Tommy said. "Bought me a burger, said I could stay with him and his friends for a while, said we'd be a family." But it became clear quickly that Dean didn't want a nephew. He wanted someone too young to ask questions and too scared to run. Dean and his crew moved packages, Tommy explained, though he didn't know what was in them. Drugs, maybe, or guns, or something else illegal that made men with hard eyes show up at odd hours and leave with duffel bags full of cash. They operated out of a series of run-down houses and trailers, never staying in one place longer than a few weeks, always moving, always looking over their shoulders. Tommy lived in that world for 8 months. 8 months of sleeping on floors, of eating whatever scraps were left, of making himself invisible when Dean's temper flared, or when strangers came to do business. He learned to be quiet, to be useful, to never cry where anyone could see. "They hit me sometimes," Tommy said matter-of-factly, like he was describing the weather. "Not too bad, usually. But Dean's friend Marcus, he was mean. He said if I ever told anyone about what they did, he'd make sure I ended up like my mom. Said nobody would even notice I was gone." Russell felt rage building in his chest, hot and fierce, the kind of anger he hadn't felt since the day he discovered Marcus and Claire together. But this was different. This wasn't about betrayal. This was about a child being terrorized by grown men who should have protected him. "One day they were driving somewhere up north," Tommy continued. "I think they were meeting someone big, because Dean was nervous. He kept checking his phone and telling everyone to shut up. We stopped at a rest stop and Dean said I could use the bathroom. I think he forgot about me for a minute. Forgot to watch. Tommy's hands twisted in his lap. I just ran. Didn't even think about it. Just saw the trees beyond the parking lot and ran as fast as I could. I heard them yelling, heard Dean calling my name, but I didn't stop. I ran until I couldn't hear them anymore. Then I kept running. His voice cracked. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know where I was. I just knew I couldn't go back. I'd rather die in the woods than go back. Russell was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. Finally, he said, "You're not going back. Ever. I don't care what I have to do. You're not going back." Tommy looked up at him, eyes shining with tears. "Promise?" "I promise," Russell said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. But even as he made that promise, Russell knew it complicated everything. He should report this, should call the police, tell them about Dean and his operation, get Tommy into protective custody. But the thought of handing Tommy over to the system, of this kid who'd already been failed by every adult in his life being shuffled through foster homes, or worse, being found by Dean before the authorities could protect him, made Russell's stomach turn. And there was another fear, quieter but just as real. If Russell reported Tommy, people would ask questions. They'd want to know why Russell had waited so long, why he'd kept the boy hidden. They'd dig into Russell's background, his 15 years of isolation, his deliberate disconnection from society. They might decide he wasn't a suitable guardian. They might take Tommy away. So Russell made a decision. He would keep Tommy here, at least for now. Would homeschool him, teach him, give him the stability and safety no one else had. It was illegal, probably, dangerous, definitely, but it was also the only thing that felt right. The weeks turned into months, and something remarkable happened. Russell began to heal. For 15 years he'd carried his betrayal like a stone in his chest, heavy and cold, a constant reminder that love was a lie and trust was for fools. He'd convinced himself that isolation was strength, that needing no one meant no one could hurt him. But Tommy changed that. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, quietly, like ice melting in spring. Taking care of Tommy forced Russell to think beyond himself, to plan for someone else's future, to care whether tomorrow came. And in caring for this broken child, Russell found himself putting back together pieces of his own shattered heart. He started smiling again, not often, but sometimes. Started talking more, telling Tommy stories about the mountains, about the wildlife, even occasionally about his own childhood before everything went wrong. He fixed up the cabin's loft, turning it into a proper bedroom for Tommy with a real mattress and wool blankets and a lantern the boy could read by at night. He carved Tommy a chess set from pine wood and taught him to play. The two of them bent over the board for hours, the only sound the crackling fire and the soft click of wooden pieces. Tommy thrived. He gained weight, his hollow cheeks filling out, his eyes losing that haunted, hunted look. He laughed more, a sound that still surprised Russell every time he heard it. The boy had an easy laugh, bright and unguarded, and it filled the cabin with something Russell hadn't realized was missing. Joy. Spring arrived slowly in the high country, reluctant and tentative. The snow began to melt, revealing the brown earth beneath. Streams swelled with runoff, and the first brave wildflowers pushed through the remaining patches of snow. Russell and Tommy worked the land together, preparing a garden plot, turning soil that hadn't been touched in years. They planted potatoes, carrots, beans and onions, practical crops that would keep through the next winter. Tommy threw himself into the work with determination, his small hands digging in the dirt, his face streaked with mud, grinning like he'd never been happier. They repaired the cabin's roof where winter had damaged it, replacing shingles and ceiling gaps. They built a proper chicken coop, and Russell made a trip down to town to buy 6 hens and a rooster. Tommy named every one of them, delighting in collecting eggs each morning, cradling them carefully like they were made of glass. "We're building something," Tommy said one evening as they sat on the cabin's porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains orange and purple. "Yeah," Russell agreed, "we are." "It feels good," Tommy said softly, building instead of running, Russell looked at the boy beside him, at this child who'd been through hell and somehow still found reasons to smile, and felt his chest tighten with emotion he couldn't name. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It does." One afternoon in late April, Tommy was exploring the eastern edge of Russell's property, an area thick with aspen and pine that Russell rarely visited. He'd been gone for maybe an hour when Russell heard him calling, his voice high and excited. Russell set down the axe he'd been sharpening and jogged toward the sound. He found Tommy standing near a massive Douglas fir, its trunk so wide 3 men couldn't have linked arms around it. Tommy was pointing at something carved into the bark about 5 feet up. Another symbol. But this one was different. It was the same 8-pointed star they'd found months ago, but larger, more elaborate, with additional markings radiating out from it. And beneath it, carved in neat block letters, were 2 numbers, 1982. Russell felt something cold settle in his stomach. "That's the year," Tommy said, his voice awed. "Someone carved this in 1982. "Yeah," Russell said slowly, moving closer to examine the carving. It was deep, deliberate, made with proper tools and care. This wasn't some hiker's idle graffiti. This meant something. "Russell," Tommy said, his eyes bright with excitement. "What if these symbols aren't just markers? What if they're leading somewhere?" Russell wanted to tell the boy to drop it, to leave the past buried where it belonged. But he couldn't deny his own growing curiosity. These symbols were on his land, carved decades ago by someone who'd gone to great effort to mark specific locations. Why? "We need to find out what this is," Russell said, the decision surprising him even as he made it. "And I think I know where to start." 2 days later, Russell made the long drive to Ridgemont, the nearest town with an actual library. He left Tommy at the cabin with strict instructions not to leave and a loaded rifle within reach, just in case. The library was a small brick building that smelled like old paper and dust. The librarian, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain, looked up in surprise when Russell walked in. Visitors were rare, and mountain men even rarer. "Help you find something?" she asked. "Property records," Russell said. "Historical ones, for land up near Crow's Peak." She directed him to a section in the back, a series of filing cabinets that held decades of county records, deeds, and surveys. Russell spent 3 hours going through them, his eyes straining in the dim light, until he found what he was looking for. The deed to his land, the 60 acres he'd bought 15 years ago at a county auction for back taxes. He traced the ownership backward, page by page, year by year. 1998, owned by the county, seized for unpaid taxes. Before that, 1983, owned by a Wilhelm Hartmann. Russell stared at the name, something stirring in his memory. He'd heard that name before, but where? He went to the librarian. "Do you have any newspaper archives, old ones from the 80s? "Microfiche," she said, leading him to a dusty machine in the corner. "What are you looking for?" "Wilhelm Hartmann," Russell said. Her eyebrows rose. "The collector? Honey, that's quite a story." Russell's pulse quickened. "Tell me." She settled into a chair, happy to have someone to talk to. Wilhelm Hartmann was a strange man. German immigrant, came here in the 60s, bought that land up near Crow's Peak and built himself a place. Kept to himself mostly, but he was known in certain circles. Art collector, people said. Had money, though no one knew where it came from. Some folks whispered he'd been involved in recovering stolen art after World War II, but that was just rumor. "What happened to him?" Russell asked. "Died in 1982. Heart attack, they said. He was in his 70s. But here's the strange part. When they went to settle his estate, there was nothing. No art, no collection, no money. Just an empty house and unpaid property taxes. His lawyer searched everywhere, but whatever Hartmann had collected over the years, it was gone. Some people thought he'd sold it all before he died. Others thought maybe he'd never had anything to begin with, just a reputation built on air. She leaned in conspiratorially. But there were rumors, of course. People said Hartmann had a vault somewhere, a place he kept the real valuable pieces. Said he didn't trust banks or museums, so he hid everything away. But if that vault existed, no one ever found it. The property went to auction, and that was that. Russell's mind was racing. The symbols, the date, 1982, the year Hartman died. "Did anyone ever search the property?" he asked. "Oh, sure," the librarian said. "At least half a dozen people bought it over the years, thinking they'd find Hartman's lost collection. But there was nothing there. Eventually, people stopped looking. Most folks figured it was just a story, you know, something to talk about." Russell thanked her and left, his hands shaking slightly as he climbed into his truck. A collection, a vault. Symbols marking locations on property that once belonged to a reclusive art collector. It couldn't be coincidence. The drive back to the cabin took 2 hours, and Russell spent every minute of it thinking. If Hartman had hidden a collection, if it was still out there somewhere on Russell's land, what did that mean? The responsible thing would be to report it, let the authorities handle it. But Russell had spent 15 years avoiding authorities, avoiding attention, avoiding anything that might pull him back into a world he'd left behind. And now there was Tommy to consider. If officials came poking around the property, if they started asking questions, someone might wonder about the 8-year-old boy living in an isolated cabin with a hermit. Someone might call social services. Russell pulled up to the cabin as the sun was setting. Tommy burst out the door, relief flooding his face. "You were gone so long," he said. "I know," Russell replied. "I'm sorry, but I found something. Come inside." Over dinner, Russell told Tommy everything. About Wilhelm Hartman, the art collector, about the rumors of a hidden vault, about the symbols that might be markers, a map left by a dead man to treasure no one had ever found. Tommy's eyes grew wider with every word. "So you think there's a treasure buried on our land?" he asked, his voice awed. "Maybe," Russell said, "or maybe it's just a story. But those symbols mean something, and I think Hartman left them for a reason." "We have to look," Tommy said immediately. "We have to find it." Russell hesitated. Part of him wanted to leave it alone, to not invite more complications into a life that was finally feeling stable. But another part of him, the part that Tommy had reawakened, was curious, was hungry for purpose beyond mere survival. "Yeah," Russell said finally, "we do. What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Over the next 2 weeks, Russell and Tommy became obsessed. Every free moment was spent searching for more symbols, mapping their locations, trying to understand the pattern. They found 6 more markers spread across Russell's 60 acres, each one carefully placed, each one visible only if you knew what you were looking for. Russell sketched a crude map on a piece of paper, marking each symbol's location. When he connected them, a shape began to emerge. Not a circle, but something more complex, a pattern that spiraled inward toward a central point deep in the woods on the northeastern corner of his property. It was an area Russell rarely visited, dense with undergrowth and fallen timber, the kind of place that seemed determined to keep people out. "That's where we need to look," Tommy said, pointing to the center of Russell's map. "If Hartman hid something, that's where it is." Russell agreed. They prepared carefully, packing water, food, rope, and tools. Russell brought his rifle, not because he expected trouble, but because the wilderness was always dangerous, and he'd learned long ago to respect it. They set out early one morning when the sun was just breaking over the peaks, hiking through country that grew rougher with every step. The terrain was treacherous, all loose rocks and sudden drop-offs hidden by overgrowth. They had to scramble over fallen trees thick as cars, push through thickets that grabbed at their clothes and scratched their skin. Tommy never complained, just kept moving, his face set with determination that made Russell's chest swell with pride. After 3 hours of hard hiking, they reached the area Russell had marked on his map. It looked like every other piece of mountain wilderness. Trees, rocks, underbrush, nothing special, But as they searched, moving in a careful grid pattern, Tommy suddenly stopped. "Russell," he said, his voice strange. "Come here." Russell pushed through the brush to where Tommy stood. The boy was pointing at the ground, at something that didn't belong. A stone, but not a natural one. This stone was cut, shaped, part of a larger structure. Russell dropped to his knees and began pulling away the undergrowth, years of accumulated pine needles and rotting leaves. More stones emerged, forming a wall. They worked together, clearing away decades of nature's camouflage, and slowly, incredibly, a structure revealed itself. It was built into the hillside, almost invisible unless you knew what you were looking for. Stone walls, expertly mortared, partially buried. And at what appeared to be the entrance, a steel door painted to look like stone, nearly invisible beneath dirt and rust. Russell's hands trembled as he cleared away the last of the debris from the door. It was heavy, industrial grade, the kind of door you'd see on a bank vault. There was no handle, just a circular indentation in the center, like it was meant to be opened with a specific tool. "He built a vault," Tommy whispered, awe in his voice. "Hartman actually built a vault." Russell sat back on his heels, staring at the door. For 15 years, he'd lived on this land, walked these woods, and never known this was here. Never knew he was living on top of a secret that men had searched for and never found. "What do we do?" Tommy asked. Russell looked at the boy, at his eager face and bright eyes, and felt the weight of the decision pressing on him. They could walk away right now. Could pretend they'd never found this, never seen those symbols, could go back to their quiet life and let the past stay buried. But Russell knew that wasn't really an option. Not anymore. Whatever was behind that door had been hidden for over 40 years. And something told Russell that it was meant to be found eventually. Maybe by him. Maybe now. "We open it," Russell said. But even as he said it, he wondered if he was making a terrible mistake. Over the next week, Russell made several trips to town, each time buying different supplies from different stores, so no one would wonder why a mountain hermit suddenly needed cutting torches and pry bars. He told anyone who asked that he was doing repairs on the cabin, which wasn't entirely a lie. Back at the vault, Russell and Tommy worked carefully. The door was locked, but the mechanism had been weakened by 40 years of mountain weather. Russell used a cutting torch he'd bought in pieces and assembled himself, slowly working his way through the locking mechanism while Tommy stood guard, watching for any signs they weren't alone. It took 3 days of careful work. On the afternoon of the third day, something inside the door gave way with a deep metallic groan. Russell set down the torch and looked at Tommy. "You ready?" he asked. Tommy nodded, his face pale but determined. Russell gripped the edge of the door and pulled. It moved slowly, reluctantly, hinges screaming in protest. A breath of air escaped, cool and dry, carrying the scent of stone and something else. Something old. The door swung open, revealing darkness. Russell clicked on his flashlight and stepped inside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing stone steps leading down into the earth. The walls were rough-cut stone, but the construction was solid, professional. Someone had spent serious money building this. Russell descended slowly, Tommy close behind him, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. The stairs went down 20 feet, then opened into a chamber. Russell's flashlight swept across the space, and his breath caught in his throat. The chamber was larger than he'd expected, maybe 30 feet by 40, with a ceiling high enough to stand in comfortably. And it was filled with things. Wooden crates lined the walls, stacked carefully, each one labeled in faded German script. Metal shelves held smaller items wrapped in cloth. In the center of the room stood several larger objects covered with heavy canvas tarps, their shapes mysterious in the dim light. But what caught Russell's attention was the desk at the far end of the chamber. It was a beautiful piece, solid oak, its surface covered with papers and journals and what looked like photographs in protective sleeves. Russell approached it slowly, almost reverently, and picked up one of the journals. The handwriting inside was precise, methodical. German words mixed with English. Dates spanning from 1968 to 1982. "What is all this?" Tommy whispered, his voice awed. Russell set down the journal and moved to one of the crates. He used his knife to carefully pry it open, revealing what was inside. A painting, protected by layers of preservation materials, but visible through the transparent coverings. Even with Russell's limited knowledge of art, he could tell it was old, valuable, the kind of thing you'd see in a museum. He moved to another crate, another painting, and another. "Tommy," Russell said, his voice shaking slightly, "I think we just found Wilhelm Hartmann's collection." They spent the next hour carefully exploring the vault, opening crates, cataloguing what they found. Paintings by artists Russell had never heard of, but that seemed important based on Hartmann's meticulous notes. Sculptures wrapped in protective materials, ancient-looking artifacts, pottery, jewelry, manuscripts, gold coins in sealed containers, historical documents that looked like they belonged in archives, and in the back corner, something that made Russell's blood run cold. A series of photographs, old black and white prints, showing artwork being recovered from bombed-out buildings, showing emaciated people standing among ruins, showing Nazi officers and stolen treasures and the devastation of war. Russell picked up one of Hartmann's journals and began to read. The entries were part diary, part manifesto, explaining Hartmann's mission. He had been a Jewish art dealer in Berlin before World War II. When the Nazis came to power, they'd seized his gallery, stolen his collection, and sent him to a concentration camp. He survived, barely, and after the war dedicated his life to recovering stolen art and artifacts. But not to return them to museums or governments, to protect them. "The world destroys beautiful things," Hartmann had written in English in one entry. "Museums are bombed, governments fall, private collections are looted. I have spent 30 years gathering these pieces, not to own them, but to preserve them until the world is ready to care for them properly. Until people remember that art is not property. It is memory, it is soul, and it must be protected." Russell sat down heavily on the stone floor, the journal in his hands, trying to process what he'd found. This wasn't just a treasure vault. It was a time capsule. A record of one man's attempt to save beauty from destruction. And if Hartmann's notes were accurate, the collection in this chamber was worth an impossible amount. Russell flipped to the last entries, written just days before Hartmann's death. The old man had known his heart was failing, had known he was running out of time. "I have no heirs," Hartmann had written. "No one to trust with this responsibility, so I seal it away. Perhaps someday someone worthy will find it. Someone who understands that wealth is not measured in money, but in what we preserve for those who come after us. To whoever finds this, do not squander what I have protected. Do not let greed corrupt what love has saved. Give these pieces back to the world, but only when the world deserves them." Russell closed the journal and looked around the chamber. At the crates and shelves, at the decades of one man's desperate mission to protect beauty from a world that seemed determined to destroy it. At Tommy, sitting cross-legged on the floor, gently examining a small bronze sculpture he'd unwrapped. And Russell realized with sudden, absolute clarity that his life had just changed again. Not in the devastating way it had changed 15 years ago when Claire and Marcus betrayed him, but in a way that felt like purpose, like destiny, like the universe had been waiting for him to be ready, to be healed enough to handle this responsibility. "Russell," Tommy said softly, looking up from the sculpture, "what do we do with all this?" Russell was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "We protect it, just like Hartmann did. And when the time is right, we give it back to the world. But on our terms, when we're ready. When we can make sure it's done right." Tommy nodded slowly. "How much do you think it's worth?" Russell glanced at Hartmann's notes, at the careful catalogue of pieces, at the estimated values written in fading ink. Even accounting for 40 years of inflation, the numbers were staggering. "A lot," Russell said simply. "More than we can probably imagine." "Enough to keep us safe?" Tommy asked, and Russell heard what the boy was really asking. Enough to keep them together? Enough to make sure Tommy never had to run again? Yeah, Russell said, his voice rough with emotion. More than enough. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their discovery settling over them like snow. Finally, Russell stood. Come on, we need to seal this back up. No one can know about this, not yet, not until we figure out how to handle it properly. They climbed back up the stairs, and Russell carefully secured the door, disguising it again with dirt and underbrush. As they hiked back to the cabin through the fading afternoon light, Russell's mind was racing with plans and possibilities and fears. Because he knew that $270 million worth of art didn't just represent security. It represented danger. Men had searched for this collection for decades, and if word got out that it had been found, those men would come. They would come with lawyers and weapons and greed, and they would not stop until they got what they wanted. Russell looked at Tommy walking beside him, at this child he'd come to love more fiercely than he'd ever loved anyone, and made a silent promise. Whatever happened, whatever came next, he would protect this boy, would protect their life together, would protect what they'd built, even if it meant protecting a secret worth more than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. Because some things, Russell had learned, were worth more than money, and the boy beside him was one of them. For 2 weeks after discovering the vault, Russell and Tommy kept their secret. They went about their daily routines as if nothing had changed, chopping wood, tending the garden, checking traps. But everything felt different now. The weight of what they'd found pressed on Russell like a physical thing, making it hard to sleep, hard to think about anything else. He spent hours at night lying awake, staring at the cabin's rough ceiling, running through scenarios in his mind. They could walk away, pretend they'd never found the vault, let it stay sealed for another 40 years. But that felt wrong, like disrespecting Hartman's legacy. The old man had protected those pieces through wars and chaos, had given his life to preserving beauty in a world bent on destruction. Russell couldn't just ignore that, but reporting it meant attention, questions, officials crawling over his property. It meant social services discovering Tommy. It meant lawyers and taxes and complications that terrified Russell more than any mountain winter ever had. He was trapped between honoring a dead man's mission and protecting the living boy sleeping in the loft above him. During the day, Russell began documenting everything. He'd bought a cheap digital camera in town, claiming he wanted to photograph wildlife. Instead, he spent hours in the vault, carefully photographing each piece, each page of Hartman's journals, creating a record in case something went wrong. Tommy helped, holding the flashlight steady while Russell worked, occasionally asking questions about the paintings or sculptures. The boy had developed a particular fascination with a small bronze statue of a dancer, her arms raised in eternal grace. "She looks happy," Tommy said one afternoon, turning the sculpture gently in his hands, like nothing bad ever happened to her. "Art does that," Russell said, focusing his camera on a painting of a Dutch landscape. "Captures moments, freezes them, makes them permanent when everything else is falling apart." "Is that why Hartman saved all this?" Tommy asked. "Because he wanted to freeze the good stuff before it disappeared?" Russell lowered the camera and looked at the boy. Sometimes Tommy's wisdom caught him off guard. This child who'd seen too much darkness but still found ways to see light. "Yeah," Russell said quietly, "I think that's exactly why." But while they worked in secret, the outside world was closing in. Russell didn't know it yet, but his questions at the library, his supply purchases, his uncharacteristic curiosity about property history had caught someone's attention. In a town as small as Ridgemont, people noticed when patterns changed, and they talked. Jim at the supply store mentioned to his wife that Russell Kane had bought cutting tools and heavy gloves. His wife mentioned it to her sister, who worked at the diner. The librarian told her book club about the mountain man researching Wilhelm Hartmann. "After all these years," she'd said over coffee and cookies, "someone's still looking for that collector's treasure." The words spread like ripples in water, quiet but persistent, reaching ears that had been listening for exactly that kind of information for months. 300 miles south, in a dingy apartment in Albuquerque, Dean Mitchell sat at a kitchen table covered with maps and property records, a bottle of whiskey at his elbow and desperation in his eyes. Dean was 42 years old and drowning. He owed money to people who didn't accept excuses, people who'd made it very clear what would happen if he didn't pay. He'd borrowed from them to fund what was supposed to be a big score, a drug shipment that would set him up for years. But the deal had gone sideways. The product was seized. The money was gone. And now Dean had 30 days to come up with $100,000, or they'd kill him. Maybe worse. He'd been searching for Tommy ever since the boy ran. Not because he cared about his nephew, but because Tommy had become valuable in an unexpected way. Dean had been in jail twice, had connections with people who dealt in stolen goods, art, antiquities, anything that could be sold without questions. And through those connections, he'd heard stories. Rumors about Wilhelm Hartmann, the reclusive collector who'd supposedly hidden a fortune somewhere in the Colorado mountains before he died. Most people dismissed it as legend. But Dean had done his research, had traced property records, pieced together timelines. Hartmann's last known residence was 60 acres near Crow's Peak. That property had been sold for back taxes in 1998 to a man named Russell Kane, who lived there alone like some kind of hermit. Dean had been planning to search that property himself when everything fell apart. When Tommy ran, when the deal went bad, when his whole life imploded. But then, 3 weeks ago, one of his contacts called. Said someone matching Russell Kane's description had been asking questions at the Ridgemont Library. Questions about Wilhelm Hartmann. Questions about property history. "The mountain man's looking for something," the contact had said. "Thought you might want to know?" Dean's heart had started racing. If Russell Kane was searching for Hartmann's collection, maybe he'd found it. Or maybe he was close. And if Tommy was with him, which Dean suspected given the boy had run toward the mountains, then Dean had leverage. He drained the whiskey, grabbed his keys, and made a call. "Pack a bag," he told his associate Marcus on the phone. "We're going to Colorado." Now, 2 weeks later, Dean's black pickup truck rolled slowly up the mountain road toward Russell Kane's property. It was evening, the sun sinking below the peaks, shadows stretching long and dark. Marcus sat in the passenger seat, a heavy-set man with dead eyes and scarred knuckles. In the back seat was Jamie, younger than the other two, nervous and twitchy, the kind of guy who'd do anything for money because he'd never had any. "You sure about this?" Marcus asked as they navigated the rutted dirt road. "Kid's probably dead. Froze up here months ago." "He's not dead," Dean said, his hands tight on the wheel. "Someone would have found the body, filed a report. There's been nothing." "So what's your play?" Dean's jaw clenched. "We find the hermit, we find Tommy. We find out if he knows anything about Hartmann's stash, and we take whatever we can get." "And if he doesn't cooperate?" Marcus asked. Dean didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew what happened to people who didn't cooperate. At the cabin, Russell was making dinner when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong, the low rumble of an engine growing louder. His blood went cold. No one came up here. No one. He moved to the window and peered out through the curtain. A black pickup was coming up the trail, moving slowly, deliberately. "Tommy," Russell said, his voice sharp and urgent. "Loft, now, don't make a sound." Tommy's eyes went wide with fear, but he didn't argue. He scrambled up the ladder to the loft and pulled the hatch closed behind him. Russell grabbed his rifle from where it leaned near the door, checked that it was loaded, and stepped out onto the porch. The truck stopped 30 feet from the cabin. 3 men climbed out. Russell recognized the type immediately. Hard men, the kind who solved problems with violence. The driver was lean and wiry, with eyes that moved constantly, assessing, calculating. That had to be Dean. "Help you with something?" Russell called out, the rifle held casually but ready. Dean smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Russell Kane?" "Who's asking?" "Name's Dean Mitchell. I'm looking for my nephew. Boy named Tommy. About 8 years old, dark hair, scared of his own shadow. You seen him?" Russell's face remained impassive. "No kids up here, just me." Dean took a step closer. Marcus and Jamie fanned out to either side, their positions deliberate, practiced. "See, that's funny," Dean said. "Because Tommy ran away about 4 months ago, ran into the mountains during a bad storm, and you're the only person living within 20 miles of where he disappeared." "Lot of mountains," Russell said. "Easy to get lost, easy to die." "Yeah," Dean agreed. "But I don't think he died. I think maybe a good Samaritan found him, took him in, maybe didn't want to get authorities involved for reasons of his own." Russell's finger moved closer to the rifle's trigger. "I live alone. That's how I like it. Now get off my property." Dean held up his hands in mock surrender. "Easy, friend. We're just talking." He glanced around the property, his eyes lingering on the cabin, the shed, the trees beyond. "Nice place you got here. Real remote, private. The kind of place where a man could keep secrets." "Don't have any secrets," Russell said. "Everyone has secrets," Dean countered. "For instance, I heard you were at the library a few weeks back, asking about Wilhelm Hartmann. Now, why would a hermit who hasn't shown interest in anything for 15 years suddenly start researching dead art collectors?" Russell's blood ran cold, but he kept his expression neutral. "Curious about the land's history. That a crime?" "Not at all," Dean said, taking another step forward. "But here's the thing, Russell. I'm curious too, real curious. Because Hartmann supposedly hid a collection worth millions before he kicked it. And you're living on his old land. So I'm wondering if maybe you found something. Maybe something valuable enough that you'd want to keep a witness quiet. Maybe a witness like my nephew." "I don't know what you're talking about," Russell said, raising the rifle slightly. "And I'm done being polite. Leave now." Marcus moved his hand toward his jacket, and Russell swung the rifle toward him. "Don't," Russell said, his voice deadly calm. "I've lived up here 15 years without shooting anyone. Don't make tonight the exception." Dean laughed, a sound without humor. "Relax, we're just having a conversation." He backed toward the truck, but his eyes never left Russell. "But here's the thing, friend. I'm not going anywhere. I'll be watching. And sooner or later you're going to slip up. You're going to make a mistake. And when you do, I'll be there." He climbed into the truck, Marcus and Jamie following. The engine roared to life, but before they drove away, Dean leaned out the window. "Tell Tommy his uncle misses him," he called. "Tell him we have unfinished business." The truck disappeared down the trail, taillights fading into the gathering darkness. Russell stood on the porch for a long time, his heart hammering, his mind racing. When he finally went inside, Tommy climbed down from the loft, his face pale. "That was him," the boy whispered. "That was Dean." "I know," Russell said, setting the rifle down with shaking hands. "How did he find us?" Russell thought about the library, the supply store, his own carelessness in thinking no one was paying attention. "I wasn't careful enough," he admitted. "I asked too many questions, made people curious." "What do we do?" Tommy asked, his voice small and scared. Russell pulled the boy close, wrapping his arms around him. "We're not running. This is our home, our land, and I'm not letting him take you." But even as he said it, Russell knew everything had changed. Dean hadn't just come looking for Tommy. He'd come looking for Hartmann's collection, which meant he'd heard the same rumors Russell had, done the same research. And now he knew Russell was hiding something. Dean would be back. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. And next time, he'd bring more than just threats. Russell spent that night fortifying the cabin, checking sight lines, planning escape routes. He showed Tommy where he'd hidden the rifle, the ammunition, the emergency supplies. They made a plan. If Dean came back when Russell wasn't there, Tommy would run to the vault, hide inside where no one would think to look. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. As dawn broke over the mountains, Russell stood at the window watching the tree line, waiting for the inevitable. He'd spent 15 years hiding from the world, but the world had found him anyway. And now he had to decide, keep running, keep hiding, or stand and fight. He looked at Tommy sleeping in the loft, at this child who trusted him, who needed him, who'd given him a reason to live again. The decision wasn't hard. Russell Kane had run once before, when Marcus and Claire destroyed his life. He'd let them take everything without a fight, but he was different now, stronger. He had something worth fighting for. And this time, he wouldn't run. This time, he'd protect what was his, even if it meant war. Russell didn't sleep that night. He sat in his chair by the window, rifle across his lap, watching the darkness beyond the glass. Every sound made his muscles tense, every shift in the wind brought his hand to the weapon's stock. But Dean didn't return. Not that night. Russell knew he would, though. Men like Dean didn't make threats and walk away. They waited, they planned, and then they struck when you thought you were safe. As the first grey light of dawn crept across the mountains, Russell made a decision. He couldn't do this alone. For 15 years, he'd prided himself on needing no one, on handling every problem with his own 2 hands. But this was bigger than him. This was about protecting Tommy, about honoring Hartman's legacy, about doing the right thing even when the right thing terrified him. He needed help, and there was only one person he could think to call. After breakfast, Russell sat Tommy down at the table. The boy's face was drawn, exhausted from a night of fitful sleep and fear. "I need to make a trip to town," Russell said. "I'll be gone most of the day." Tommy's eyes widened with panic. "You're leaving me alone? What if Dean comes back?" "He won't," Russell said with more confidence than he felt. "Not in broad daylight. Not yet. He's watching, waiting. But I need you to stay inside, keep the rifle close. And if you see or hear anything strange, you go straight to the vault. Understand?" Tommy nodded slowly. "What are you going to do in town?" Russell took a breath. "Something I should have done weeks ago. I'm going to call someone who can help us. Someone I trust." The drive to Ridgemont took 90 minutes, Russell's old truck rattling over washboard roads and hairpin turns. His mind churned the entire way, rehearsing what he'd say, how he'd explain 15 years of silence, how he'd ask for help after cutting every tie to his old life. In town, he found a payphone outside the post office. Most people used cell phones now, but Russell had never owned one, never wanted to be that connected. He pulled a worn piece of paper from his wallet, a phone number he'd kept all these years but never called. His hands shook slightly as he fed coins into the machine and dialed. The phone rang 4 times before someone answered. "Talbot." The voice was older than Russell remembered, gruffer but unmistakable. "Marcus," Russell said, then caught himself. "I mean Agent Talbot. It's Russell Kane." Silence on the other end. Then, "Jesus Christ. Russell? Is that really you?" "Yeah," Russell said. "It's me." Marcus Talbot, not to be confused with the Marcus who'd destroyed Russell's life, had been Russell's closest friend in college. They'd been roommates, had stood up at each other's weddings, had been closer than brothers. Marcus had joined the FBI after graduation, worked his way up to special agent in the Denver field office. When Russell's life imploded 15 years ago, Marcus had tried to help, had offered money, connections, a place to stay. But Russell had been too broken, too ashamed, and he'd pushed everyone away, including Marcus. They hadn't spoken since. "Where are you?" Marcus asked, his FBI training kicking in. "Are you okay?" "Colorado Mountains," Russell said, "near Ridgemont, and no, I'm not okay. I need help." "What kind of help?" Russell took a breath and told him everything. About Tommy, about Dean and his threats, about Wilhelm Hartmann's vault, and the collection worth hundreds of millions. He spoke for 10 minutes straight, the words pouring out like he'd been holding them in for years. When he finished, there was a long silence. "Russell," Marcus finally said, his voice careful. "This is serious. Multiple federal issues. Harboring a minor, possibly kidnapping charges if we're not careful. And if that collection is real and you haven't reported it, that's a whole other set of problems." "I know," Russell said. "That's why I'm calling. I need help doing this right. I need to protect Tommy and honor what Hartman wanted. But I don't know how to navigate this without losing everything." Another pause. Then Marcus said, "I'm coming up there. Don't do anything. Don't talk to anyone else. And for God's sake, don't open that vault again. I'll be there tomorrow morning." "Thank you," Russell said, his voice rough. Marcus, I'm sorry for disappearing, for cutting you out. We'll talk about it when I see you, Marcus interrupted, but his tone was warm. Just hang tight. And Russell, be careful. If this Dean guy is as dangerous as you say, he's not going to wait long. Russell hung up and stood there for a moment, staring at the phone. He'd made the call, set things in motion that he couldn't take back. Part of him wanted to run to his truck and disappear into the mountains, take Tommy and vanish like he'd done 15 years ago. But he was tired of running, tired of hiding. It was time to face things head on. He bought supplies at 3 different stores, spreading out his purchases so no one would remember. Extra food, batteries, medical supplies, ammunition. Things he'd need if Dean came back before Marcus arrived. On the drive home, Russell's mind was already planning where he'd position himself if there was trouble, how he'd get Tommy to safety, what he'd do if things went wrong. The cabin came into view just as the sun was setting. Russell's heart jumped into his throat when he saw another vehicle parked near his porch, but as he got closer, he recognized the old ranch truck, and his shoulders relaxed slightly. It belonged to Graham Cole, his nearest neighbor 12 miles south. Graham was in his 70s, a former Marine who'd survived 2 tours in Vietnam and 40 years of mountain winters. He was tough as boot leather and respected boundaries, which is why Russell tolerated him. Graham was sitting on Russell's porch steps, his weathered cowboy hat pulled low. Tommy stood in the doorway behind him, looking relieved to see Russell's truck. "Graham," Russell said, climbing out. "Everything okay?" The old rancher stood slowly, his joints creaking. "Was about to ask you the same thing. Found some tracks on the boundary between our properties this morning. 3 men judging by the boot prints. They were watching your place from the ridge." Russell's blood went cold. "When?" "Early this morning. After sunrise but before 8. They stayed for maybe an hour, then headed back down the mountain. Looked like they were scouting, taking their time, studying your layout." Graham's eyes were sharp despite his age. "You in some kind of trouble, son?" Russell glanced at Tommy, then back at Graham. "Maybe. Nothing I can't handle." "That boy there." Graham nodded toward Tommy. "He yours?" "He is now," Russell said firmly. Graham studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right then. I won't pry. But those men, they weren't hunters or hikers. They moved like they had purpose. Military training, maybe. Or worse." He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to Russell. "Wrote down their license plate. Got a good look at their truck before they saw me watching." Russell took the paper, gratitude flooding through him. "Thank you." "Don't mention it," Graham said, settling his hat. "Us mountain folks, we look out for each other. You need anything, you fire 3 shots in the air. I'll come running, or as close to running as these old legs can manage." He climbed into his truck, then paused. "Whatever you're protecting, Russell, whatever's worth men like that sniffing around, you make sure it's worth the cost. Not everything is." Russell watched him drive away, then looked down at the license plate number in his hand. Dean was escalating, getting bolder, which meant Russell was running out of time. That night, Russell told Tommy about Marcus, about the call he'd made, about help coming. Tommy listened quietly, his small face serious in the firelight. "Will he take me away?" Tommy asked softly. "Will they put me in foster care?" Russell knelt in front of him, putting his hands on the boy's shoulders. "I won't let that happen. Marcus is a good man. He'll help us figure out how to do this legally, how to make you mine for real. But it might get complicated. There might be questions, meetings, people poking into our lives." "I don't care," Tommy said fiercely, "as long as we're together." "We will be," Russell promised. "Whatever it takes." But even as he made the promise, he heard Graham's words echoing in his mind. "Make sure it's worth the cost." Marcus Talbot arrived at 9 the next morning in an unmarked SUV, alone as promised. He was 51 now, his dark hair shot through with silver, his face lined with years of hard cases and harder decisions. But his eyes were the same ones Russell remembered, sharp and kind in equal measure. The 2 men stood facing each other for a long moment. 15 years of silence stretched between them. Then Marcus stepped forward and pulled Russell into a hard embrace. "You look like hell," Marcus said. "Mountain living doesn't agree with you." "Neither did city living," Russell replied. "Figured I'd split the difference and look terrible everywhere." Marcus laughed, and just like that, something eased between them. Inside the cabin, Marcus met Tommy, and Russell watched as his old friend assessed the situation with trained eyes. The way Tommy stayed close to Russell. The protective way Russell's hand rested on the boy's shoulder. The love that had grown between them, obvious to anyone paying attention. "Okay," Marcus said, settling at the table with coffee. "Let's start with the boy. Tommy, I need you to tell me your story. Everything. And I need you to be honest, even if you think it might get Russell in trouble." Tommy looked at Russell, who nodded encouragement. So Tommy told it all. His mother's death, Dean's cruelty, the packages and threats, the night he ran into the storm. His voice was steady, clear, and Marcus took notes without interrupting. When Tommy finished, Marcus sat back. "That's trafficking. Possibly drugs, possibly worse. Dean Mitchell is already in our system. Couple of priors for assault and possession. He's been on our radar, but nothing stuck." He looked at Russell. "By keeping Tommy, you probably saved his life. But we need to make this legal. Fast." "How?" Russell asked. Marcus pulled out a folder. "I did some digging last night. Tommy's mother had no will, no provisions. Dean was granted temporary custody by the state because he was next of kin, but he never formalized it. Never filed proper paperwork, never showed up for check-ins. Legally, he's in violation of custody terms." "So Tommy's essentially a ward of the state," Russell said, his stomach sinking. "Not necessarily," Marcus said. "Emergency placement can be made with suitable guardians, especially in cases where the child's safety is at risk. I can fast-track a temporary custody order, put you down as emergency foster. Then we start the process for permanent adoption." Russell's throat tightened. "I'm a hermit living in the mountains. I haven't had a steady income in 15 years. What judge is going to give me custody?" "One who understands that love matters more than tax returns," Marcus said firmly. "Look, it won't be easy. There'll be home studies, interviews, background checks. But Russell, you've got no criminal record, military service, and most importantly, you've clearly been taking care of this kid for months. That counts for something." Tommy grabbed Russell's hand under the table, squeezing tight. Russell squeezed back. "Okay," he said. "What do we need to do?" Marcus spent the next hour explaining the legal process, making calls, setting wheels in motion. Then he said, "Now tell me about this vault." Russell led him to the site, Tommy trailing behind. When Marcus saw the hidden structure, saw the steel door and stone walls, his eyebrows rose. Someone spent serious money on this. Inside the vault, Marcus moved slowly through the collection, his flashlight playing over paintings and sculptures and artifacts. He picked up Hartman's journals, reading entries with growing awe. "Russell," he said quietly, "do you have any idea what this is?" "Hartman's life work," Russell replied. "Art and artifacts he spent 40 years protecting." "It's more than that," Marcus said. "Some of these pieces, they're not just valuable. They're historically significant. Paintings that were thought lost. Artifacts from collections destroyed in the war. This isn't just treasure, it's cultural heritage." He turned to Russell, his face serious. "This has to be reported, properly, through official channels. The State Department, Homeland Security, probably Interpol. There are protocols for recovered stolen art." Russell's chest tightened. "What happens to it?" "Depends," Marcus said. "Hartman's notes say he acquired everything legally, recovered pieces through his own network. If that's true, if he can be proven as the rightful owner, then his estate has claim. But he died without heirs, so it becomes more complicated." He closed the journal carefully. "But here's the thing, Russell. Hartman's will, according to these notes, specified his wishes. He wanted the collection to fund Holocaust education and art restitution. That's a legal directive. We can honor that." And the finder's fee? Russell asked, thinking of Tommy, of their future. Marcus smiled slightly. Standard practice for discoveries like this. Usually 10 to 20% of assessed value, depending on circumstances. Even on the low end, we're talking millions. Russell's knees went weak. Millions. Enough to secure Tommy's future, pay for college, buy a proper home, never worry about money again. But it also meant attention, scrutiny, questions. It meant the end of his quiet life. He looked at Tommy, who was gently touching a bronze sculpture, his face full of wonder. And Russell realized his quiet life had ended the moment he pulled this boy from the storm. Everything since then had been building to this moment, this choice. "Let's do it right," Russell said. "Let's honor Hartman's wishes and make sure Tommy's protected, whatever it takes." Marcus nodded approvingly. "I'll start making calls, but Russell, once this goes official, people are going to come. Lots of people. Press, officials, probably treasure hunters and opportunists. You need to be ready." "I know," Russell said. "But there's something else. Dean. He knows I'm hiding something, and he's not going to wait for official channels. He's coming back." "When?" Marcus asked, his expression shifting to the hard focus of an FBI agent. "Soon," Russell said. "I can feel it." Marcus pulled out his phone. "I'm calling for backup. We can have a team here in 6 hours." "No time," Russell interrupted. "If Dean sees official vehicles, he'll run, and then he'll just wait for another chance. We need to end this now." Marcus studied him. "What are you suggesting?" Russell's jaw set. "We use me as bait. Let Dean make his move, and when he does, you're here to take him down." It was risky, dangerous, everything Russell had avoided for 15 years. But hiding was over. It was time to fight. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Marcus called in 2 agents he trusted, veterans who could move quietly and handle themselves. They arrived in civilian vehicles, set up positions in the woods surrounding the cabin, invisible but watching. Russell went about his normal routine, making himself visible, predictable. Tommy stayed inside, safe but scared, a go-bag packed by the door in case everything went wrong. Marcus positioned himself in the loft, rifle at hand, radio connecting him to his team. "If this goes sideways," Marcus told Russell, "you get Tommy and run, don't be a hero." "I'm not a hero," Russell said. "I'm just a man protecting his son." It was the first time he'd said it out loud. His son. The words felt right, solid, true. As the sun set on the second day of waiting, Russell's instincts screamed that tonight was the night. The air felt wrong, charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. He was right. At 11 p.m., Russell heard it. Multiple engines moving slowly up the mountain road without headlights. He keyed the radio Marcus had given him. "They're coming." "Copy," Marcus's voice crackled back. "Stay calm. Let them approach." Russell stood on his porch, backlit by the cabin's lights, making himself a target. His heart hammered, but his hands were steady. 3 vehicles pulled into the clearing. Dean's black pickup, plus 2 more trucks Russell didn't recognize. 7 men climbed out, and Russell's blood ran cold when he saw they were armed. Not just pistols, but rifles, tactical gear. This wasn't intimidation. This was an assault. Dean walked forward, confident now, backed by numbers and weapons. "Evening, Russell," he called out. "Hope we're not interrupting." "You're trespassing," Russell said, his voice calm despite the fear coursing through him. "Armed trespassing. That's a felony." Dean laughed. "You going to call the sheriff?" "Go ahead. By the time they get up here, we'll be long gone, along with anything valuable you've been hiding." "I told you there's nothing here." "Liar," Dean spat. "You found it. Hartman's stash. I can see it in your eyes, and you're going to show me where it is, or—" He pulled out a pistol and pointed it at the cabin. "Or I start putting holes in that pretty little cabin. Maybe one of those holes hits something important, like my nephew hiding inside." Russell's hands curled into fists. "You don't give a damn about Tommy." "No," Dean agreed, "but I give a damn about not getting killed by the people I owe money to, and Hartman's collection is my ticket out. So here's how this works. You show me the vault, I take what I need, and everyone walks away breathing. And if I don't? Then we tear this place apart and take our chances. But either way, I'm not leaving empty-handed. Dean raised the pistol, pointing it at Russell. Last chance, where is it? Russell met his eyes, saw the desperation there, the violence waiting to break free, and he made his choice. You want to see it? Russell said quietly. I'll show you. Dean's eyes lit up with greed. Smart man, lead the way. Russell started walking toward the woods, away from the cabin, toward the vault site. Dean and his men followed, weapons ready. They didn't notice Marcus and his agents moving through the trees, didn't see the trap closing around them. Russell led them to the vault entrance, now partially cleared. Dean pushed past him, staring at the steel door. Open it, he commanded. Can't, Russell said. Don't have the tools. Cut through the lock last time, took 3 days. Dean swore viciously. Then he grabbed Russell by the jacket, pressing the gun to his ribs. Then you're going to tell me what's inside, every detail, and it better be worth my time. FBI, drop your weapons! Marcus's voice boomed through the darkness. Spotlights flooded the area as agents emerged from the tree line, weapons trained. Dean spun, dragging Russell with him as a shield. Back off! Dean screamed. Back off or I'll kill him! You do that, you'll be dead before he hits the ground, Marcus called back. It's over, Dean. 7 agents, all with clear shots. Your men are already dropping their weapons. You're the last one. Russell could feel Dean trembling, could smell the sweat and fear on him. The gun pressed harder into his ribs. You set me up, Dean hissed in Russell's ear. For him, Russell said quietly. For Tommy. For the chance at something better than running forever. For a long moment, Dean didn't move. Russell could feel the man's finger on the trigger, could sense the calculation happening behind his eyes. Then, slowly, Dean lowered the gun. Smart choice, Marcus said, moving forward with handcuffs. As Dean and his associates were arrested, read their rights, loaded into vehicles, Russell stood in the cold mountain air and shook. Not from fear, though there'd been plenty of that, but from relief, from the realization that he'd faced down his demons and survived. Tommy burst from the cabin and ran to Russell, throwing his arms around him. Russell held the boy tight, burying his face in his hair, whispering, It's over. We're safe. It's over. The next weeks were a whirlwind. Art experts from the Smithsonian arrived to catalogue the vault's contents. Historians documented Hartman's journals. Insurance assessors calculated values that made Russell's head spin. The final tally came to $273 million. $273 million in paintings, sculptures, artifacts, and historical documents that would change museum collections worldwide. The news spread like wildfire. Within days, Russell's cabin was surrounded by press, researchers, officials. He gave one interview, brief and to the point, explaining how he'd found the collection, why he'd protected it, what Hartman's wishes had been. He made it clear that the money didn't matter as much as honoring a dead man's mission. The public ate it up. Russell Kane became a folk hero overnight, the reclusive mountain man who'd discovered treasure and chosen integrity over greed. He hated the attention, but he endured it for Tommy. The legal process for adoption was complicated, just as Marcus had warned. Social workers came to inspect the cabin, interview Russell, assess his fitness as a guardian. Some were skeptical. A hermit with no income, living miles from civilization, wanting to raise a traumatized 8-year-old? It seemed like a recipe for disaster. But then the letters started arriving. Graham Cole wrote about Russell's character, his integrity, the way he'd built a life of honor in the wilderness. The librarian in Ridgemont wrote about his curiosity, his desire to do right by Hartman's legacy. Jim from the supply store wrote about 15 years of quiet reliability, of a man who paid his debts and caused no trouble. Even Marcus wrote a letter, explaining how Russell had been betrayed, had rebuilt himself, had become the kind of man who risked everything to protect a child. But the most powerful testimony came from Tommy himself. In a private interview with the judge, Tommy explained what his life had been before Russell. The fear, the hunger, the certainty that no one cared if he lived or died. And then he described what his life was now, learning to read the forest, to build things with his hands, to trust that tomorrow would come and someone would be there. "Russell saved my life," Tommy told the judge, his voice clear and strong. "Not just that night in the storm, every day since. He taught me that I matter, that I'm worth protecting, and I don't want to be anywhere else. I want to be his son." The judge, a woman in her 60s who'd seen every kind of family situation imaginable, wiped her eyes. 6 months after Dean's arrest, the adoption was finalized. Russell Kane was officially Tommy's father. They celebrated quietly, just the two of them, with a cake Russell had attempted to bake, and Tommy had graciously pretended to enjoy. That night, as they sat on the porch watching stars emerge, Tommy said, "Can I call you Dad now?" Russell's throat closed up. He nodded, not trusting his voice. "Okay," Tommy said, leaning against him. "Dad." The word hung in the mountain air, simple and perfect. The finder's reward came through 3 months later. $500,000, deposited into an account Russell had to open because he'd never had one. It was more money than he'd ever imagined possessing. He used some of it to improve the cabin, adding proper insulation, a water heater, solar panels for electricity. He set up a college fund for Tommy, fully funded before the boy's 9th birthday. He bought a new truck, his first vehicle in 15 years that didn't require prayer to start. But mostly, he saved it, kept it as security, as proof that Tommy would never go hungry, never be cold, never have to run from anything ever again. The collection, as Hartman had wished, was distributed to institutions dedicated to Holocaust education and art restitution. Museums around the world received pieces they'd thought were lost forever. Families who'd had treasures stolen during the war were reunited with heirlooms, and a new foundation was established in Wilhelm Hartmann's name, funded by the sale of a few pieces the old man had specifically designated for that purpose. Russell was invited to the foundation's opening, held in Denver. He almost didn't go, but Marcus convinced him. "You're part of this legacy now," Marcus said. "You owe it to Hartman to see what his sacrifice created." So Russell and Tommy made the trip, their first real journey off the mountain together. At the ceremony, surrounded by Holocaust survivors and their families, by artists and historians and people whose lives had been touched by Hartman's mission, Russell finally understood. It wasn't about the money. It had never been about the money. It was about memory, about preserving beauty in a world that tried to destroy it, about protecting what mattered when everyone else had given up. An old woman approached Russell after the ceremony. She was 93, a survivor of Auschwitz, and she held a photograph of a painting. "My grandmother painted this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Before the war, before they took everything. I thought it was gone forever, but Wilhelm Hartman saved it, and you found it. You gave me back a piece of my family." She took Russell's hand in her fragile ones. "Thank you. Thank you for not keeping it hidden. Thank you for understanding that some things belong to all of us." Russell could barely speak. He just nodded, holding this woman's hands, understanding for the first time the full weight of what he and Tommy had found. They weren't just millionaires who'd stumbled onto treasure. They were guardians of memory, protectors of legacy. They were, in their own small way, heroes. Life on the mountain changed, but not as much as Russell had feared. Yes, there were occasional visitors, researchers wanting to see where the vault had been, journalists doing follow-up stories. But mostly, it returned to something close to peaceful. Russell and Tommy fell into new rhythms. Tommy started attending school in Ridgemont twice a week, the rest done through homeschool with Russell and online courses. He made friends, joined the community, became known not as the tragic orphan or the treasure kid, but just as Tommy Kane, Russell's son. Russell, too, began to emerge from his self-imposed exile. He started teaching wilderness survival classes to troubled teens through a program Marcus connected him with. Started volunteering with search and rescue, his knowledge of the mountains proving invaluable. Started slowly and carefully reconnecting with the world he'd abandoned 15 years ago. He even, after much convincing from Tommy, joined the town council's land preservation committee. "You care about this place," Tommy argued, "and people listen to you now. You can make a difference." Russell grumbled about meetings and politics, but he went, and he discovered that having a voice, using it to protect the wilderness he loved, felt good, felt like purpose. 2 years after finding the vault, Russell stood on his porch early one morning, coffee in hand, watching the sun paint the mountains gold. Tommy was still asleep inside, growing like a weed, already up to Russell's chest. He'd be a teenager soon, would face new challenges, new struggles, but he'd face them with a father who loved him, with a home that was safe, with a future that was bright. Russell thought about the man he'd been 15 years ago, broken by betrayal, convinced that isolation was strength. He'd been so wrong. Real strength wasn't in walls, it wasn't in keeping the world out. Real strength was in opening the door when someone knocked, in pulling a dying child from a storm, in choosing to trust again, even when trust had destroyed you before. The cabin door opened, and Tommy shuffled out in pajamas and bare feet, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Morning, Dad," he mumbled. "Morning, son," Russell replied, ruffling the boy's hair. Tommy leaned against him, still half asleep, and Russell wrapped an arm around his shoulders. They stood there in comfortable silence, watching the day begin. "Dad," Tommy said after a while. "Yeah? Think we'll ever find more treasure?" Russell laughed. "I think we already found the most important treasure. The rest is just details." Tommy considered this, then nodded. "Yeah, I guess you're right." But then he grinned, his eyes lighting up with mischief. "Still, it would be cool to find more." Russell shook his head, smiling. "You're incorrigible." "I don't know what that means, but probably," Tommy agreed. They went inside to make breakfast, arguing good-naturedly about whether pancakes counted as a nutritious meal. And as they moved around the kitchen, bumping into each other in the small space, laughing at Russell's terrible cooking and Tommy's worst jokes, Russell felt something he hadn't felt in 15 years. Complete. Whole. Home. The vault was empty now, its treasures dispersed to museums and families around the world. But Russell had discovered something more valuable than art or gold or historical artifacts. He'd discovered that sometimes the things we're meant to find aren't buried in the ground. They're standing right in front of us, terrified and alone, waiting for someone brave enough to offer shelter from the storm. And once you find them, once you choose to protect them, you discover that you weren't the one doing the saving. You were the one being saved all along. Months turned into years. Tommy grew from a frightened 8-year-old into a confident teenager, tall and strong, with Russell's quiet competence and his mother's gentle heart. He excelled in school, particularly in history and art, subjects that felt personal now, connected to the legacy they'd uncovered. He talked about becoming an archaeologist or maybe a museum curator, about protecting treasures the way Wilhelm Hartmann had. Russell supported whatever path Tommy chose, knowing that the boy would make a difference in the world, would honor the miracle of his survival by living fully. Russell himself changed in ways he'd never expected. The hermit who'd spoken to no one for 15 years became a fixture in the community, respected not just for the treasure he'd found, but for the man he'd become. He sponsored 3 scholarships for local kids to study conservation and art history. He donated land for a youth camp where city kids could learn wilderness skills. He even, though it took years to work up the courage, reached out to old friends from his previous life. Not Marcus and Claire, they were ghosts he could finally let rest, but others. People he'd abandoned in his pain who welcomed him back without judgment. Some relationships could be rebuilt, he learned. Not all, but some. And that was enough. On Tommy's 16th birthday, Russell gave him a gift. It was the bronze sculpture of the dancer, the one Tommy had admired in the vault all those years ago. "Where did you get this?" Tommy asked, his voice awed as he unwrapped it. "Bought it at auction," Russell said. "One of the pieces that was sold to fund the Hartmann Foundation. Figured it should stay with us, a reminder." "Of what?" Tommy asked. Russell was quiet for a moment, studying the sculpture, the dancer frozen in eternal grace, arms raised, face tilted toward invisible light. "That beautiful things survive," he said finally, "even when the world tries to destroy them, even when everything seems lost. They survive because someone cares enough to protect them." Tommy understood. He always had. "Thank you, Dad," he said, setting the sculpture carefully on the shelf above his desk. "For everything. For pulling me out of that storm. For keeping me safe. For showing me what family means." Russell pulled his son, tall now, nearly grown, into a tight embrace. "Thank you for giving me a reason to open that door," he said, his voice rough, "for reminding me what matters." They stood there in the cabin that had become a home, surrounded by the life they'd built together, and neither of them needed to say anything else. Some truths were too big for words. That evening, as the sun set over the mountains, Russell and Tommy hiked to the spot where the vault had been. It was sealed now, the entrance filled in and marked with a simple plaque that read, "In memory of Wilhelm Hartmann, 1912 to 1982. He preserved beauty when the world forgot its value. May we remember." They stood before it in silence, paying respect to a man they'd never met, but whose legacy had changed their lives. "Do you think he'd be happy?" Tommy asked. "With what happened to the collection?" Russell considered. "I think he'd be satisfied. The art is protected, preserved, shared with the world. His mission is complete." "And us?" Tommy pressed. "Do you think he'd be happy that we found it? That we're the ones who finished his work?" Russell looked at his son, at the young man he'd become, strong and kind and whole. And he thought about the broken hermit he'd been, the child dying in a storm, the impossible odds that had brought them together on a mountain no one else cared about. "Yeah," Russell said softly. "I think he'd be happy. I think maybe this is exactly what he hoped for, that whoever found his treasure would understand it wasn't about gold or paintings, it was about protecting what matters, about choosing love over fear, about building something that lasts." Tommy nodded, satisfied. They turned and walked back toward the cabin, toward the warm lights glowing in the windows, toward the life they'd fought so hard to build and protect. And as they walked, Russell realized that Wilhelm Hartmann had taught him one final lesson. Legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's what you give forward. It's the children you protect, the values you instill, the beauty you preserve so others can experience it. It's choosing every single day to be worthy of the trust placed in you by people you'll never meet, by the future you'll never see. Russell had been betrayed, had lost everything, had hidden in the mountains for 15 years convinced that isolation was the only way to survive. But a dying child and a dead man's treasure had taught him the truth. Survival isn't enough. We're meant for more than just enduring. We're meant to connect, to protect, to love, to build legacies that outlive us. Anyone can give up when the world gets hard. Anyone can build walls and call it strength. But real courage, the kind that changes lives and shapes futures, comes from opening your heart when everything tells you to close it, from pulling strangers from storms, from protecting treasures not because they're valuable, but because they're beautiful, from choosing every single day to be someone worth remembering. As the stars emerged over the Colorado mountains, Russell Kane stood on his porch with his son beside him, no longer a hermit but a father, no longer hiding but building, no longer broken but whole. The mountain man who'd sworn off the world had discovered that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't buried in the ground. They're standing right beside you, growing taller every day, calling you Dad. And that's worth more than all the gold and art and ancient treasures ever discovered. Because some legacies aren't measured in millions. They're measured in love, in sacrifice, in the quiet determination to make sure that one more child never has to face the storm alone. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories are waiting for you. Click to keep discovering with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that sometimes the things we find end up finding us, and that the greatest treasures are the ones that change who we are.